This week's Torah portion of Ekev starts with a rather challenging passage from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 7. It starts with the positive side of the covenant. If you keep these ordinances and keep them, perform them, the eternal your God will then keep the covenant for you that God swore to your ancestors. And this is a continuation from the book of Genesis. God will love you, God will bless you, God will multiply you, multiply the fruit of the womb, and so on. Of not just you, but your cattle, and even multiply your fruit itself from your wine, your oil, and all these things. This is a rather common theology of blessing through the natural world. But then it's verses 14 and 15 in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy that become a little more challenging. Firstly, you shall be blessed above all peoples, saying there will be no sterile male or barren female among you or among your livestock. And that's really challenging. It is in line with the rest of Torah's theology, which is that if there is someone who is not able to give birth, then they reach out to God and pray to God, and God may change that. Barrenness is not necessarily a permanent condition, but is conditional. It is often fixed by reaching out. And this implies a very strong theology from Torah of how important it is, especially for an early, smaller people, to have children. But of course, today, when there are millions and millions of Jews, and some people aren't able to give birth, it leads to a bit of a challenge. Because it's one thing to have theology that promises reward. It's another thing to say, if you don't do these things, though, it will be held back. Or even promising reward can be a problem. Because if that reward doesn't appear, then you might make the theological journey backwards. By which I mean, if God promises something to the people, and the people don't experience it, then the people turn around and say, God hasn't rewarded us. And what was the behavior that God didn't reward us for? For keeping the covenant, which is a very important aspect throughout Torah, particularly throughout Deuteronomy. So in other words, in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, God says, as well as many other places, if you keep my commandments, then these good things will happen to you. The problem is that if those things don't happen to you, then people can easily turn around and say, then the first part of that wasn't upheld by us. And this reminds me 30 years ago when I was in Eisha Torah. I was in a class given by somebody called Svi, and Svi was sharing the Tariag Mitzvot, the 613 commandments, and saying how important it was to keep them, otherwise terrible things will happen like the Holocaust. And he mentioned Reformed Jews, and I stopped him and the rest of the class, as I did many times then. And I said, what did you just say? Explain it further. And he said, God's very clear that if you keep the commandments, then good things happen to you. And if you don't keep the commandments, then we are punished. And so there must be a reason for the Holocaust, he said. And so as you look at what was happening in German society at the time, the rise of Reformed Judaism, how so many Jews at the time were Reformed Jews who weren't keeping commandments, then we can see the connection. So therefore, the rise of Reformed Judaism led to the Holocaust. Now that's obviously an abhorrent thing to say. It's abhorrent to blame Reformed Jews for the Holocaust. But this is a theology that many people, particularly in the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community like Eisha Torah, do hold, that it's their fault. And so similarly, we can turn around and say, well, if somebody isn't able to have children, is it their fault? And so what started as a theological promise actually ends up as blame. And that can be extremely difficult, extremely problematic. Especially because, in fact, it's not the individual, it's communal. It's communal reward and punishment. So what that means is, if we hold this theology, and if we hold that there can be some blame, if someone isn't able to have children, it must be our fault in some way. we must have failed in some way to keep the commandments. And so what happens is then we start blaming other people. Well, I kept the commandments, so maybe you didn't. And so it leads to a feeling of distrust. So even though it seems like a positive theology, a theology of if you do good, then you'll get a reward, the problem is that these rewards don't appear. For example, the next verse, God will remove from you all illnesses and all the evil diseases of Egypt which you knew, and God will not set them upon you, but God will set them upon your enemies. In other words, the Jewish people will never suffer even a cold. We will never have illness. Please God, such a thing could happen, but hold on a moment. This theology, which seems really positive, seems to inspire people, just dear people gathered around Mount Nebo, about to cross into the promised land. Just follow the commandments and everything will be amazing for you. It sets the people up for failure. And it sets the people up to blaming other people or blaming themselves. Why did I get this illness? Because God said if we keep the commandments, we'll never get illnesses. Why did I get this illness? It must have been because of something I did wrong or something someone else did wrong. It's not realistic. There's never been a time in Jewish history where there hasn't been a Jew that isn't ill. Of course not. And so therefore, we're always failing. And that becomes another problem of this theology from Deuteronomy. That every time somebody is ill, we can turn around and say, well then, I guess we're not good enough as a people. And we could use that to inspire ourselves. Look, see somebody else is ill, quick everyone, fulfill more mitzvot. But that's also, the other problem with that is it becomes like magic. We only do it in order for the reward as well. And we try to fulfill mitzvot in order to have a positive magical outcome. We will suddenly all keep Shabbat as strictly as possible, and then nobody will become ill. But only, and there's another problem with Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 15, only our enemies will become ill. We take the illnesses that would have been on ourselves and they get cast onto our enemies instead. This is all very difficult. I would say I struggle with the theology of Deuteronomy. And thank goodness the Bible includes another book which challenges Deuteronomy and seems to have been included specifically as a counterpoint to the theology of Deuteronomy. And that book is the book of Job, which I've mentioned before. The book of Job starts by explaining very clearly that Job is a totally righteous man. And yet, terrible things happen to him. And his colleagues, who have known him for years, follow Deuteronomy's theology and say, it must be because you did something wrong. They blame him. And Job turns around repeatedly and says, no, I didn't. And at the end of the book, God appears and says, no, your friends or your colleagues are wrong. Bad things sometimes happen. And for me, the book of Job is an essential counterpoint to the book of Deuteronomy, therefore, because the book of Deuteronomy has some really important passages, some really positive passages. Just last week, we saw Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6, an essential passage in Judaism. And yet, some of the book of Deuteronomy is also really challenging. And I think this inspires us, or at least it inspires me, to look deeper. To be able to say our theology develops and grows. It always has done. Our people started with Torah theology, with Tanakh theology, with the theology of the Bible, and then that developed into rabbinic theology, which was different. It was very similar, but different. And rabbinic theology had many different branches to it. And then mystical theology started coming in. And then Hasidic theology and Reformed theology. And so many different understandings of God and how God works in the world. I think as we get to the book of Deuteronomy, it's very easy for us to say, I don't like this, I'm out. But even our Bible turns around and says, it's much more complicated than that. Nuance is hard, especially in theology. It's much easier to open up the Bible and go, wow, I don't like that. This whole book is nonsense. I'm out. And that, I appreciate, is what some people do today. I think our role as a Jewish community is to say, wait, that was then, this is now. Just as our people has grown, so our theology has grown. Just as our people has changed, so our theology has changed. It's developed. It's created more nuance. Different theologians throughout Jewish history have disagreed with each other, have come up with totally different understandings of God, and that is good. So we can look at the theology of chapter 7 of the book of Deuteronomy, and we have permission to turn around and say, that chapter's not for me. Now, for some people, including that lecturer I mentioned earlier, for some people it is for them. They actually find it very helpful to have this theology so that they can blame other people for all the wrongs in the world. Some others of us, though, actually want a more complicated theology than that, not a theology of blame. So this week in our Torah portion of Ekev, as we read this Torah portion and as we wrestle with this theology, I really encourage you to wrestle. Earlier in the book of Genesis, we have this term Yisrael, as Jacob struggles, wrestles with God. And that's what it is to be Jewish. Not necessarily to believe, but to wrestle, to struggle. And if you are wrestling and struggling with God, then you are at least appreciating that there is God in some way. But what is that God? Who is that God to us? And who is that God to you? So this Torah portion of Ekev, particularly this opening part of Ekev, I encourage you this week to use it as a springboard for theological reflection. Who is God to me? Is God the God of reward and punishment? And if not, don't stop there. If not, who is God to me? And I hope that during this week you'll be able to wrestle, to explore differing avenues, and if you want any help with exploring differing theologies of Judaism, please reach out to me. I hope that you'll join us in our service this evening. I'll be joined by some lay leaders in our service. Our Torah study tomorrow isn't so much a Torah study, it's preparation for the month of Elul, which itself is preparation for Rosh Hashanah, which is getting rather close. So I encourage you to join us for our services tonight and tomorrow, and also for our study session, which helps us prepare for the month of Elul. I hope to see you soon, and I wish you Shabbat Shalom.